Kia ora, we're live. Welcome to this meeting of the environmental implementation meeting, I guess, workshop for an update on the environmental funding project. We'll just start off with Tarakia, Tuikaronga, Tuikararo, Tuikawaho, Turi Chivo, Turko, Tuikitu Hari Tangata, Korong Po, Korong Tio, Huye, this workshop is being recorded and it will be uploaded on the website. Thank you, Councillor Lou. The workshop is being recorded and will be uploaded on the website after the completion of the workshop. We have an apology at this stage from Gary, who is running late, but Gary is in transit, so he'll be here as soon as he can get here, which is awesome. We've got Nick on live stream. Hi, Nick. So awesome. Just before we start, we'll just Libby just like to say a couple of things regarding some funding announcements to be made in the last week.
Thank you. So I'm not sure if everyone knows, but the government has announced, I think it was last night, that there's $30 million being provided from the International Visitor Conservation and Tourism Levy to fund projects to boost biodiversity and the tourist economy. And so from this, there is going to be $1 million over 2 years provided to support the Wallaby program nationally. It's not clear yet how much funding of that will come to Otago, but it's really great news that there's been more money put into that. And there'll also be funding put into wild and conifers, and it's hoped that Otago Regional Council will receive $500,000 of funding to deliver or to boost control works across the region, which is really great to see some more funding coming into those projects. And because it related to funding, I thought I would let everyone know here if they didn't know already. So that's just it for me.
Does anybody have any questions regarding that for them? Gretchen?
Right. I was wondering whether we know if there's other funding, I think, as well around pest control and targeted biodiversity type work. Do we have any more information than that, or is it not going to be in Otago, or they're still working that out?
I don't have any more information about where that is yet. There was something to do with deer control, which was announced to be in Fiordland and somewhere else. But as far as I'm aware, there was nothing else tagged for Otago, but there's probably more detail to come.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
Mine was along the same line. My understanding it was national parks, not necessarily just Fiordland. So I just wondering if we could get some clarity about that, because it does. I mean, it's great that the government has recognised that they have a role in this space, and actually it isn't necessarily our role. And we need to, in the big picture, be careful that we're not going into something and giving them a way out or something that's their responsibility as well. So they said deer and goats, but it would be really good to get understand as we go through this, that we can get that information shared with us as soon as they are certain about what they're doing. Should ask the Minister of Hunting and Fishing yesterday, he might know.
Cool. Thanks very much for that. So that's all good news. If we get any more funds as well, gratefully received. So today, our workshop today is around the environmental funding project and how we administer the long-term plans commitment to putting $2 million into large-scale environmental funding from next year on. So that's the reason why we're here at this workshop today, and Libby's joined with Emma and Marina from Frequency Consulting, who've been doing a lot of the work. So that's really awesome that you guys can come down and talk to us in person, and we're very happy that we got a pretty close to full train before you as well. So that's really good. It's a big job, just to be fair. So it's first of all, it's awesome that the regional council and the people, voted pretty strongly in favour of having a large scale environmental fund for the regional council to administer into the future. But with that comes responsibilities, and the responsibility is as to how we administer and make sure it's distributed equitably around the Takiwai, the area. So this is just building on to where we've got to now, and building on as we start to build basically a project around the funding and how we administer it. So today's workshop's going to be into pretty much 3 brackets. First bracket is going to be just like an introduction, what we've done so far, and what, the high level feedback we've had from the stakeholders, and just perhaps a little bit around where the new biodiversity strategy fits in as well. And then following that, that probably won't take too long, but we'll just probably you or somebody will talk to us about, and we'll have time for questions. But then we get into our 2 main items. The first one being defining large scale around size, and large scale around landscape. So we want to spend a wee bit of time just delving into that and working through to get what we as a group think needs to be included in a definition. Maybe not about writing the definition, but coming to some consensus as what needs to be in the definition. So that we think that's going to take could be like the first hour might be burned up by then. I wouldn't be surprised. And then we've got a couple of hours to go to the main course, which is really looking at the different funding models and how they fit in with their SWOT analysis and their implications, but also trying to get some sort of ranking system so that we can the target at the end of the day is to come up with 2 or 3 of the options that we can do a bit deeper research into and make a more detailed presentation at the next workshop. So that's sort of like the 3 parts. So hopefully we'll probably if we get going, we'll have a bit of a break between we'll try to get the large scale funding one nailed, and then we might have a little bit of a break and then get into the group one. So I'll just pass over to Emma.
Kia ora koutou. Thank you for having us back again. Apologise for the really. Good. Keep going. The heavy content. So we've tried to split it up the best we could into sort of a pre-reading pack to give you some background information, so we didn't have to go over all of it in detail today, and could jump to the, as Lloyd said, some of the meaty stuff and move forward. So my timings are probably a little bit ambitious up there with the half an hour for the large scale and landscape scale. So we'll probably spend a little bit longer on that, and might try and break around 3 o'clock, I think, before we get into the last discussion, as Lloyd said. So really today is an opportunity to discuss the work that has been done in the last few months since we met in October, and then look at some detail around some of those different funding models and the definition moving forward, reflecting on some of the feedback that we've had. Probably the first thing I just want to say before we get started is that from all of the people we have talked to, and there's been a lot and a few still to go, ORC is kind of the envy of particularly a lot of councils. The investment and environmental initiatives across the Eco Fund and incentive funding, and with the new money, is on par with Auckland and Waikato, that they invest in this area. So for a lot of other councils, they couldn't believe that when we told them the money they were available, they were just like, wow. So you're the envy of other areas in the country. So that's good to know. And probably the only other point that I wanted to make for you guys to be aware of is the level of engagement we've had has been very, very good. Your other partner local authorities have been very engaged in this process, and I've spent a lot of time with Marina and I talking about the work that's happening across the TAs within the ORC boundary, as have a lot of other regional and unitary and other councils across the country. So we talked to a massive chunk, and a lot of their staff have spent a lot of time with us, shared confidential internal documents and things like that as well. So no, not shared confidential, shared documents from their own internal processes and stuff as well. So don't want to get anybody in trouble. There hasn't been sharing confidential information, but been useful in terms of sharing, application forms they use for grant processes and things like that, for us to get a better understanding of how things are working in other regions. So really, at the end of today, it's a good opportunity. What we want to get out from today is for everyone to have a greater understanding, to have really sort of a clear direction around the components that we'll have in a definition, and to have an opportunity to discuss and rank in some sort of priority using a matrix, the different range of funding models available, so we can kind of make a call on what we look at in more detail for the next workshop. There's just a couple of notes that were in the pre-reading in terms of where we got to last time from the discussion, in terms of the importance around the definition, the areas that were sort of priority, the interests around salary and operational funding, and the long-term view around sustainability as well. There was quite a lot of information in the reading pack around some key themes that came out from the research that we've done so far. We've still got a number of stakeholder meetings to go, but probably fair to say from the range of people we talked to, there's been some pretty consistent information that's come out. So without wanting to rehash a lot of what's in the reading pack, just wanted to put up kind of one slide with 4 key areas that if we had to group all of the information together, this is probably some of the themes that came out. And then have a few minutes really if there was any questions or comments from the information in the reading pack that you that anything wasn't clear or you wanted to ask questions about for clarification or further information. So those 4 kind of areas was really around the system readiness and capability, and this was really around how the wider kind of environmental system operates and at council level and at community level. So a lot of councils now with their funding and investment is prioritising governance support, training and education for their community providers, helping to build the evaluation and research base and funding roles and staff with a deliberate purpose of building relationships, partnerships and collaboration rather than funding project delivery. The environmental, and a lot of what we heard really was that overall the environmental delivery systems reasonably immature, a lot of newer providers accessing funding streams that have evolved over time, or council investment has been new or has changed considerably over time. And as well as the philanthropic sector, a lot of the research and evidence really shows that New Zealand as a whole, the philanthropic sector is reasonably immature when compared to other countries such as the States. And that the funding system kind of is seen as more valuable and sort of cost-effective method of investment than just project delivery alone. So that came out quite strongly from providers and other councils in terms of the importance that looking after the whole system plays. And a lot of the research and evidence as well that we looked across other sectors. Sport and rec sector was an example. Just from my own background experience, knew that they had gone through a lot of this work post-COVID when there was no Class 4 gaming funding and all funding for community sports sort of stopped. So they're a couple of years ahead. The data-driven decision-making was another area, looking at how investment needs to follow strategy and the evidence around environmental priorities. And where it's been successful and sustainable is often where the decision-making has come at a technical science level, or has taken place at a management or multi-organisational level as opposed to at a political level. And then the success of the relationship. So that's come through very strongly from everybody that there's no one right model to allocate funding or no one type of initiative to invest in, but the success really comes back of the structure or approach that is made really comes back to the strength of the collaboration and partnership that's happening in the community or the area. And then the contextual relevance is kind of the other thing that again sort of stems from that. And there's no one right answer or model. It's what will be best for Otago will be taking into account the environment and the community, the partnerships, the available funding, the providers in the community of what's available. And that the definition or approach that's relevant for ORC kind of needs to be based on those old sort of SMART objectives of what's measurable and reasonable and realistic for you to achieve. So they were sort of the themes. So happy any questions or comments from the volume of information that was in the pre-reading pack, if there's anything anyone wants clarified or has any particular comments to make.
Andrew.
When you talk about data-driven decision-making, I assume that's broadly speaking, because there is data and data, and it comes from all sources. And it may even be, I assume it will be, photographs which show evidence of a particular, I don't know, species of some form of biodiversity being damaged by browsing animals. I'm just using it as an example. So when you say data driven, that's very much broad in terms of the ability to influence the decision makers.
Yes, and probably more at a prioritization level of the challenge of having community groups or money available to community groups to ask, to apply for, to solve a challenge, and how that then aligns with whether that is deemed a biodiversity priority from the council perspective of matching the data and evidence around priorities and where investment should be made. You know, the level of degradation to a landscape versus where a community might want to invest money, in terms of that in an ideal world you would have all of your data, you would know your biodiversity priorities in order, and it's hard because you're not always comparing apples with apples, and a strategy, and then you would flow your funding based on your aligned priorities. But even from that, you know, from the science perspective, a lot of it's a point in time of data. And if, you know, the example Environment Canterbury gave us is, you know, the Port Hills wasn't necessarily high biodiversity, and then they had a massive fire. So things can change quite quickly.
Thank you, Kevin.
Yeah, so probably just following up on that with the reliance on data, and I'm not saying there isn't a need for data, but it's often been said that we, as an organisation, create a lot of data and do a lot of planning and a lot of policy, but actually haven't shot a rabbit yet, which is not fair comment. But so that's, you know, I just yeah, it's just getting that balance right when we write criteria that we're that data is showing outcomes or showing how things perform, but it's not at the expense of getting the job done.
Yeah.
That would be my comment around that.
It's good, thank you. So it's, at the end of the day, there's, you know, the high level view of all our stakeholders that come back, that Emma's talked to and come back. So it's really good to have those four key points that we keep in the back of our mind as we move forward. So.
Yeah. And just probably the other thing quickly to keep in the back of our minds is around the timing and alignment of this investment and funding with the biodiversity strategy that's being led obviously by ORC at the moment. And this is just a quick slide that Shay helped put together with me in terms of the timing, and the strategy team have been involved in some of our initial discussions and given some feedback, as has the biodiversity working group around the definition. So this is just a quick snapshot of the alignment of the timing. So obviously in an ideal world, potentially you would have a refreshed strategy with some priorities and an implementation plan that some of this funding could align with. And the reality is that some of the investment in this money will come before the biodiversity strategy. So it's not really it's just to be aware of, flagging that as opposed to necessarily asking you to do anything differently. It's just flagging it.
Sorry, by the very nature of the timing that you've got here, and I appreciate that that's where we've sort of put it, it almost stops or precludes some of the models that you've suggested, because getting co-funding becomes almost too tight on the first year at least, I presume, as we rolled it out, because the chance of getting co-funding if we haven't got our ducks in order.
Yeah, and I think on that point, one of the things that we haven't done is I've flagged it in the slide deck, but isn't a purposeful, a direct discussion today, is around the transition model. So when we go into the models, I sort of flagged the implementation time frame without giving kind of a transition plan to kind of put the cart before the horse.
No, I'm just going to add to that. It's a good point. I think the focus for council should be to select the best model. And if that means that you direct staff to go and come up with a transition plan, which might be don't spend it all for a while, you know, there's other options, just because we're waiting for it, doesn't mean we have to spend it all. But I would be focusing on not what we can achieve by the 1st of July this year. Look at, you know, we've always talked about this being a legacy for this council. So what is going to be the optimum way to set this up? And if that means it's not achievable for 2, 3, 4 years, then there are hybrid options we can look at in the intervening years that still give council a chance to invest where you want to, but might not be the full version.
Yeah, no, that's very much where I was going. And I suppose the other associated question is, and I presume you've done this work elsewhere, is how long it has normally taken to get set up, which I wasn't so clear from the reading of paperwork, to set it up well.
Yes, and to be fair, a couple of the meetings we only had yesterday with a couple of other councils with models, particularly more the long-term one. So when we go into talking about those, I can share some of that information. But yes, I think Richard makes a really good point. The intent really, when we get into that discussion, is that long-term aspiration of what you want it, because then there's lots of ways to get to that point and build it up over time.
Thank you.
So that's a really good introduction. Any other questions? Awesome.
Cool. So we're going to get sort of into the first chunky bit now, around the definition. So after our last workshop, we have done a lot of work on council's behalf of looking at a lot of research and evidence base for large scale and landscape scale. And part of our stakeholder engagement with everyone we've met with has been to ask them what their view of large scale is. And that's, to be honest, opinion based to a degree. It's not, it's asking community providers, it's asked other councils what they use as it, or what people think it should mean. So this is sort of a word cloud. There's no one colour or one font that overrides the other. This is just really the terms that came up over and over again. It's not really a perfect kind of word cloud in that sense. But really, I suppose the key thing that came out is everybody that we asked had no one set view of what it meant. No person said, I think it's this. They said, I think it's this, and I probably should think about that, and you could include this. And the academic research and evidence certainly did not give us any more clarity either. It's very contextual, as I said. Some things talk about large scale being on a global scale. Some talk about it at a community level. It's all open to interpretation, really. So some of the background information around what we did find, and the key things what we found was in that background reading. And for you to sort of have looked over and seen some of the interpretations, but really a lot of those key things that came out are on that slide. Looking at making intergenerational impact, ecosystem level change involving mana whenua and being really strong on a lot of the partnership and collaboration, multi-year funding or long, large scale and long term came out a lot as well. And probably the thing, particularly from providers and those working in communities that came out very strongly, was the request to stop asking us to think of new things and support us to do what we're already doing. So that was something that was quite interesting as well. So that was just sort of a snapshot. As I said, there's more details in the pre-reading pack. So in terms of, and Lloyd covered off a little bit when we started, the ideal place for us to get to today is look at a definition at a high level in terms of the things to have included, not necessarily the actual wording of a definition. We had a bit of a play around of some actual definitions and put them in the reading pack just as examples. They were kind of all the same thing, just a little bit more wordy than others, with the intent that after this workshop, once we know the key parameters of what you want in and out, we will go away and actually do the wordsmithing and the drafting. But certainly what we've found from other councils who've taken this approach and got to a point of a definition is they have a certain criteria underneath which staff have worked on to develop with the support and sign off of councillors. And then that forms some of the management approach to how they manage the investment and the application process. So, and we'll go through a couple of those examples as well, because Waikato in particular have done significant work in this area and have shared a lot of their information with us, which has been great. And then that kind of criteria or what falls under that definition that you could look at, including, will be what comes into the final report and the final presentation and workshop that we do later on in May. As part of that. So The first activity we'd like you to do, and we probably just want to spend 10 or 15 minutes on this, is we'll split you into two groups. We've got some butcher pads and some post-its and some pens and things like that. And just to kind of get really clear on the three things that you want the fund to achieve. Knowing that we've already kind of talked about this last time to a degree, we've thrown a bit of quite a lot of information at you. But kind of I think it's good to revisit it now at this point of actually reading some information and seeing some feedback. What is it we want to get out of our investment? Once we've done that for about 10 or 15 minutes, then we'll just get you to stay in the groups. And Lloyd has asked that we spend some time writing down some keywords of what your interpretation of large scale is, or the things that you would like included that's important, and also from the landscape scale perspective. And it might be that you think they're the same, or that you have different components that you want to note as part of that. Then we'll present back to the group. The other thing that has come up a couple of times, and we discussed it at ELT when we caught up a couple of weeks ago, was around also as part of that definition, how you want to look at the money. Do you view it as a $6 million investment that's spread over 3 years, or is it a $2 million per annum investment? Because that can potentially change your interpretation and definition as well, and how the definition becomes applied to the model that you want. So Olivia and I hand out some paper. We have a little bit of a imbalance of numbers of people on the room. So 2, 4, 6.
Yeah, 4 to 4.
7, 8, 9. So whether we want to split and change seats for a little bit, and we'll probably give about 10 minutes. 10 minutes for the first bit, and then probably 15 for the second bit, and then present back. And we will use the whiteboard to record all the comments and feedback that we get from today. And then when we will recirculate next week or later this week, the slides back to you with all of your discussion notes in it as well. Any questions?
Any questions? Let's do it. You got another butcher, is there another butcher pants?
Yeah.
Oh, I've got one.
We just go, small letters, high letters.
No, it's brilliant.
This is one here by
We just had to find somebody who could walk to this table.
Yeah.
so we did.
Okay, that's fine. I'll I just know.
What, what's it very difficult to do that?
Yeah, just wait for this next.
Yeah. and
Well, there's
probably,
actually these post-its.
Joe's just for
What about those things?
Where was
Right, so I'm flooding in the phone. Andrew's. So he's given us the answer already. Looks like this. Yeah. So it's gonna go with a cup of tea.
What are your answers?
I haven't read them.
Cheating.
We need a break.
What was my last one?
Yes.
Oh, sorry.
Intergenerational.
That's the tricky part.
I did say I wasn't environment as right across the street, isn't it? So it's like it's beautiful.
Maybe that's.
That's one on what you're saying here, but if I did.
Is that him for the days?
It's done. It's done.
See, because it's like
Yeah,
those.
probably, yeah.
No, she was going down.
So what we're
And the priorities, enable-
Not on me, worry.
Fingers crossed.
As generational outcomes. I can't do the same. The priorities.
That's what I want to see.
The
Yeah,
priorities are
the intergenerational.
about environmental improvement,
And there's some other notes I made on that actually. someone
So
computer
during
got-
like.
I must say, I did my homework, I did it twice. 'Cause I
That's
came
right.
up with
Same here.
We don't want to just do quick.
And but I think they could be.
Well, what's got to
sort of fitted
ensure,
into
yeah,
design
is that
skills
if you get
about
the wild and
long
finds out,
lasting,
stay out. You don't
yeah,
stop like.
long-lasting
events.
environment.
Yeah.
You keep going all the way through.
It's
So
generation.
gains or-
Now that generations one, I too, the
Well, this is
ability.
just this.
Yeah,
a
that's,
very
yeah,
start.
yes,
Just-
which is.
This is a.
Yes.
Yeah.
So that's why I thought I was broad definition. You know what the-
How's yours?
it's
Well,
involved.
how to make it.
What about something that's
Changing
I think that's a.
Experimental.
Yeah.
That's.
Something that,
Oh, yeah,
that may fail. Something that may.
when I was,
She's got.
when I was thinking about that,
So
I
I
thought
have said
that
to Alex.
my idea
Criteria.
and the whole
Yeah.
The things you'd like to
Yeah.
actually see.
funds will be
You were painting
used
pictures,
further
what you
out
was
of
just
the
describing.
history.
As a result of this would be.
So in that way, it probably doesn't have that much R&D in it, but fear of failure shouldn't be a reason as to not.
So I think there might be another experiment to do new things, there'll be more experience as a change. So you So we will.
You see, what I put a lot of the stuff, the context of my role with Yellow Pink.
That's it, like, I don't know,
That's fine.
do I need anything else?
Well,
Yeah. Because then that covers your community
No
stuff,
reason why.
so the indirect.
So, I mean,
So the community stuff isn't, we don't want to do it ourselves, otherwise it would be funded.
We should be exporting $1 million exports.
So that's about the community law.
Exporting
Yeah.
knowledge.
And that's why it's the indirect.
And that's what.
Oh, direct
but
orders.
at the same time, this.
The end point is that the community cares more about the environment and stuff than, yeah.
Just.
It all comes out.
Yeah.
Yeah, because no matter what the
I
priority
guess around the community stuff, I've.
So
I should just put these, some of the experimental inspirations.
Yeah.
Yeah, just put them as those, just.
Yeah,
So you
only
want-
my 3 weeks, and who's everybody
So
else's
you
3 weeks?
the board here means.
And also security.
Targeted, but more.
Across the whole, but it's actually more than that too, it's across the whole area, it's also being careful not to, cut out, things like lack of life experience, to focus on peace, or to focus on bringing, other species back, but there's also other things.
So you think so you're talking about.
It's in our strategic.
Yeah, was that,
South of, that there
we
was.
want to get out,
Making
was that how we're doing it,
Yes.
will that be
It's cattle feed and reducing methane by
a
90%. What was it? Cheap as that. That's no brainer. And then they say, we want to have government support.
Let's stay on our things.
How is it on floor? This is on task. No, this is on task.
Yeah, that's why.
Well, but
See,
So we
I
wanted to-
How would that fit into here?
discussion
was thinking
coming
through
around
this
the
last
future.
night,
One
and I
is
thought that's.
games,
Because I did have some thinking, most of my thinking was directed at
the stuff about
government, but I was also thinking that, you know.
community,
I like the name
with
with that, Mark Benua and
and that can include giving them security.
Our
to know
organisations,
that
we've got set out.
continue.
I don't think we have a place.
why don't we do this in
And
colours?
yes, can include that.
Well, that's fair, but that's,
And-
that should be
and-
done through the science
You know, I
organisations.
I mean, some of these.
About our,
But you do still have to keep going.
4 more minutes around the 3 things you want to achieve, and then we'll go on to the
Sorry, I just.
definition.
So that's going to include security
That's why.
and something else.
no offence.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So.
And something else.
We want it to be, we want to be.
That's
We want to have a target.
Straight.
We want a target.
This is a-
Exactly. Target.
Okay.
So what you're
But
saying.
yes,
well,
like, because I think the things about enduring, because, I mean, it's good, no, it's really good to capture it, but is there something else?
And I don't, yeah.
But why are we, what are we comparing them
It's
to?
something-
Okay, that's why we have to.
To enhance
Rather than just
biodiversity.
doing it totally.
So we've got impact.
It's generational.
So we've got one, we've got.
I think it
Enduring. That's a good idea.
Intergenerational.
Enduring effect.
I think collaboration is one.
What are we achieving?
Yeah, so that's the top one, which is, I'm gonna put significant environmental outcomes. Yeah, long-term and significant, because I mean, you could just go for.
They have to touch multiple lives is what I said, yeah, needs to be,
So,
so just
that-
your own little badge, you keep to yourself.
The idea behind deep
You're
is when
probably
we
gonna
tried to
see
get
the
rid of rabbits under the rabbit hole, got so close to getting rid of them and then decided, oh, we don't need to do that work anymore. So deep is going on, making sure that we stay with a program, even when it looks like it's nearly complete, we stay.
That's the years we want to play.
Does that make sense? No, that's good, because that's, yeah, that was just. That program.
So long-term significant, does that include the intergenerational?
Complete in the last bit of it.
Oh, yes, please.
One is the achievable. We want to achieve that.
This is the thing that, if we thought it was
That'll be one of the
achievable, we
targets.
probably wouldn't find anything to do with it.
More about
That's strength for the code.
Yeah, but achievable, I think is a scary word.
Intergenerational.
So,
Yeah.
we'll get
Oh.
like that. Yeah, like they'll agree, because
Oh.
it's named like this deal. And then especially to do what, whereas if we said like rich, and I said
Or
people in
empowering.
communities, but even empowering
So
is
the
like
impacts,
empowering
oh, you're gonna do it for all
to
of
do
them.
what?
The
So then,
intergenerational.
Well,
like, a whole lot of things we could write down that are awesome about that. Yeah.
yeah, but they've got the passion. We can't do it ourselves. That is the name of the passion.
Yes, but why? Is it
Yeah.
just-
They all link together.
And it's like you do this.
Yeah.
to achieve this.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
one
that's
There's inherent value in
minute.
enhancing community connectivity.
In 1 minute,
stuff
we're
like
gonna
that,
present back around
but
the
is
three
that- is
things
the inherent value of reading.
that you want to achieve.
Science, we.
Well, we won't get the money from these very people that we're rating. And these very neighbours do what they need to do, and that's what this report showed. If we've got so many submissions on it, because they want to be able to get that up.
Yeah.
That's another question, like you might, but they might.
Well,
want to-
and can they use it the right way? Use it the right way? And.
So, yeah, that one
Then we
is.
get down there as well.
No idea what the thunderstorms are gonna
Yeah.
happen, but
If
if you see it raining on the hill.
And so, but doesn't it come in?
We need to like that.
Okay, I'm gonna stop you there.
You've got the precincts and input on
Yeah. Alignment.
Yeah, we got to show it.
Yeah.
What's the other one that Andrew?
I can't whistle,
Strategic priorities.
children can.
Not. So just, you know.
We'll stop there. Thanks.
All right, you're reporting back.
Yeah, thank you, Richard.
Possibly hang on there. Actually, I'm
so,
thinking like-
I'm just gonna stop the discussion there for a little bit before we go into the definition, because I know
And,
we could talk about it for a while, and I know you've probably been thinking about it for a while as well, so just each group, it doesn't have to be well formed, doesn't have to be wordsmithed perfectly, but I will just write up the things that have come to mind in terms of the three things that you want the fund to achieve. We don't have to get to a one agreeable point today, but it will help frame those long-term outcomes, which will in turn inform what your definition looks like as well of how you define it. Lloyd, would your group like to start?
Kevin's got it completely sorted here.
Wow.
It's readable and everything. I'm
Yeah,
quite
and I'll
impressed.
just write up,
And I'm left-handed.
I'm left-handed too, so
Well, you'll be good.
fabulous.
So we've got, There are three words, intergenerational, collaborative, and aligned to strategic direction.
No need for us to respond.
Eh?
Ours are
And
exactly
around-
the same.
So simply around our intergeneration, we had the impact of the outcomes were enduring. Around collaborative, we had, so it's across the spectrum of community, and also we followed the word inspirational, so whatever we want in one part, we want to be inspirational to other parts. And then, of course, aligned to our strategic direction.
Aligned to strategic direction.
Yeah.
Now,
Achieving.
Yeah, that's- Oh, yeah.
the question I have as part of that from your group was the collaborative. You've talked about communities.
Yeah.
What about the collaborative in the sense of your other local authorities?
No, that is our
Yeah,
community.
we had that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
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 the
articulated.
spectrum, that's why we put down the word.
Yep.
Spectrum.
Across the spectrum of community, which goes from,
Yeah.
Science, iwi, TAs, communities, what else did we
because
have?
you said you only wanted one word, you
Schools.
see.
Oh,
I think they nailed that second one better than us, I have to say, collaborative, which we've been enabling people and communities.
Yeah.
But apart from that, you're the same. We had enduring, intergenerational, long-term and significant for environmental outcomes, they're all the same.
sorry, just slow down a little bit for me, Kate, and
Oh, no,
Jane.
and see the top one, see, under that, you see, I'd be putting that, you're looking at either words enduring, long-term, significant environmental outcomes, or improvement, sorry. Yeah, we gave choices of words. We're here for us over here.
Yeah,
Under your laptop, we did things like security, mana whenua, red tape resolved in changing people's practices generally, so that
Is that more than three words?
it is more than three words, we acknowledge that, we're fair for us, I just said that.
so what was the overarching word you used to describe that, Kate? I didn't hear the first, when you were talking
No,
about.
we're collaborative.
Oh, the
We had
collaborative.
enabling, but we like collaborative, I
Yeah.
think, because I think that was where we were trying, we weren't happy with the word enabling, we couldn't come up with a better one.
Yeah.
We'll give it to them.
Competition.
And the other one was aligned strategic priorities, which is virtually the same as aligned strategic direction. We'll give that.
Yeah.
The strawberry.
So essentially, the three things that you want the fund to achieve is to enable community action, collaboration, patch, whatever the term is, to get engagement and buy-in and collaboration across the wider environmental system, of which ORC would take the assumption here is that ORC would take the leadership role, as also the regulator, potentially, no?
No, I don't think we've got
Other way,
that
other way
far.
around, take a support role.
Yeah.
Yes, well, we don't want
Yeah.
to
The
do.
fundies are gonna be the.
We'll be looking for existing really mature structures.
Yeah.
No, we won't. We'll be giving it to the best strategic, because we can't, the
Well,
mature
otherwise, we're
structures
gonna
won't-
have to do some leadership.
Yeah.
That's the next part of the discussion, right?
Yeah. It's how you let those others in, Gretchen.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that the important concept to me is that other groups are doing work that we aspire to do and don't do.
Yep. So from a delivery system, there will be people who will do on the ground delivery at a community
Stuff
level.
that
There
we
will be
can't.
things that community providers and communities will do that ORC it's too inefficient to do, it's too expensive to do, are unable to do. But do you think there is an element though, if you are the ones looking to set direction and investment, that you will inadvertently need to take a leadership role in how you collaborate with everybody else?
I think that's the discussion
I'm
we're
not
gonna have
necessarily convinced of that.
after this one, because that's.
You don't have to agree with me, I'm just asking questions
Yeah,
to
I'll
form
be saying that comes
discussion.
under, that comes us ensuring that we have whatever we're looking at aligns with our strategic direction. So that is our leadership, we're setting very good strategic direction. Then we let them rip.
I mean, like, we are the one talking about it now. We are the ones
Yeah.
setting up the fund and deciding how it is going to function. So I guess there's obviously some leadership in the establishment, but I think if we're talking about the actual functioning of it, then that's the discussion that we haven't had.
Yeah.
And it's precious, it's really precious funding.
Mhm.
So we've got to be really careful not to spend it all in setups.
Yeah.
We've got to get it working as well as we can.
Okay, so in terms of the things you want to achieve, reasonably aligned, you've got it down to three kind of key areas. So Libby, can you just flick to the next slide for me, please? So the next bit we're going to do for about another 10 minutes is just use another bit of paper. We'll take the paper at the end in case I miss anything that we record down today. So reflecting on the information that we put in the pre-reading pack, and you've all got copies of that, around what the evidence, some of the research and the academics reading says about landscape scale and large scale, and then some of what your stakeholders and partners feedback. Use the paper that you've got to jot down some points around what you think should be included in those definitions, the key elements or features, so not the writing of it. And if you think they're the same, that's cool. If the words mean the same thing to you, or if they're different, jot down some notes for that. So look at, split your paper in half, right, put landscape scale and then large scale, and then we'll feedback what the key bits are you've got. And if we get time before a break, we can talk through the couple of examples from what other councils have done. So I'll give you 10 minutes or so to have that discussion in your groups.
Sorry.
One's geographic and the other one's not.
Or at least not entirely.
Yeah.
Let's go with the first one is large scale.
Large scale. So, you know, defining it, defining down to the category about what to.
Oh, what's yours like?
Include any. Like mine, just technically fall out.
Yeah.
Like,
And it's that balance of
it has to be
whether
multi-site.
conversation comes in.
It's one side, but it's not really big.
That's really cool, but
Okay, that's a transition thing I'm going to suggest is, could I just put that?
These two as the name of it. It's
Yeah.
completely different to these two. And then there's a discussion, are these the right? It's probably not.
Yeah, because if you're saying the definition of large scale is larger than X.
yeah, stuff.
acres,
I think, well, what we can decide.
If it's more than.
Yeah, so I think biological scale.
We're just drawing arbitrary lines somewhere.
Wow, it's
No, it's yeah, the definition of large, so just do.
And even
The existing food barn, which is
put money in school.
Well, even as. But that main hole is the smaller scale.
One is the trying to connect.
And I think the reason more large scale, to me at least, is there's some projects that if they were applying to that small pool, would take up the whole pool, because the financial side, so that's goes all the way to
That's putting together loads and loads of loads.
just the financial amount they're asked. And then also the other with the restriction on. They could only be for each year. I can't remember the time scale was. And so we just want to enable a project to be small within that restriction for that smaller category.
That's all.
I mean, I think the
I think
two
collaborative as well.
things that I need to see is the geographic ones. And that recognises the fact that
I know.
you're around your boundaries.
Is it?
A lot of community.
Yeah, and also
Fill in the
that you
gaps.
try and do one.
You fill everything in,
What about,
make it
you know,
large
if you talk
scale.
about pest control, it's sneaking in over the wall, so it's sort of.
So here's another example.
Yeah, yeah, but also the timescale, and we've been talking about that, it has to be long-term as well.
But I don't know exactly where we're going to draw the lines, and even with like if we say, oh, it has to be multiple entities working together, one community
no,
group that's just really big. And
No, no,
that's a lot of
so
support
I was
stuff.
comparing it to the Eco Fund, which doesn't actually drive you to collaborative projects, and it's harder to
Yeah.
do. Because you're funding through bits and lots.
Oh, in terms
Yeah.
of the
Yeah.
siloing and the
Yeah,
nature.
yeah.
Right, but that's more
So what I've said
the
is,
nature of the funding model rather than.
So that's.
absolutely, so that's a above that. So under landscape, we've got geographically large number of communities, border issues and time spans.
Can we leave it? Because I just don't want people to fall out of this.
Yeah. Because you would probably enter into partnership.
Like,
Could be a thing that we
What
could
about
do.
your biological?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I think biological
Ideally, you
is
wanna try and get stuff
investment.
the current eco fund project in their main and
Well, I think you want the collaboration.
scale.
So if you've got to
Scale that they're working on, or the scale of the impacts. If you're enhancing water quality, that's got impact. Like,
achieving us
you could have a project that maybe.
And then you have.
built in our-
People underneath.
Nursery.
Yes.
Especially.
And what actually is.
So
So you've got all those
into
things.
And I'm not saying we should fund something like that, but in terms of definitions.
Can come underneath and go around and look and
It's
go.
not like.
Well, hang on a minute, where's the gap?
Technical,
You've got a common
massive
goal.
scale
That would be
funding.
right, that would be
Which is what we're trying to do.
Yeah, but how do you measure the site impact of the project?
tell us that we're gonna plant these trees, not just grow them.
Right, but if the money was just for the.
Strands, multiple strands.
So does large
Yeah, I
scale
guess they
mean
have a plan.
going forward as well?
But yeah, certainly think to.
It's,
See what everyone thinks about maybe not hitting
that was it.
The thing about large financials is quite a useful thing to discuss as well, because actually it might not be.
everybody's doing.
So, yeah.
Already, we'll get ready to do that.
Activities and I've got my.
We don't have
You're gonna do the.
No.
What are you gonna do the?
Yeah.
She.
So then it's.
You stick them in there and go, okay, so what.
Yeah.
No, let's carry on.
Yeah, I know what you're saying.
So you're saying come from different funds.
And maybe, yeah.
They can go and
Maybe
find
not.
money for that. Absolutely, it's a eco fund.
Yeah.
It's like COVID.
You're still going to go, you're still going to go premium to give those best projects without that.
Yeah, exactly.
In view of.
But she said, I know, she said one of the things.
They may only be,
And she got a lot this morning. And she only
It
get.
feels like.
Yeah,
Yeah,
it's
it's
hard to
really
be-
defining. something.
That's fine.
Yeah,
So
Comparing it to
You understand what I'm saying?
Yeah.
We've got to make sure we don't-
those smaller.
Like-
so I don't think that necessarily.
No, no, she has.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
Yeah,
no,
that's what I'm
yeah,
saying.
no, that's what, yeah, that's what I'm trying, that's what I'm saying, that active that way.
The application, probably gonna.
So all of a sudden, you know, we've got scrutiny there now, like, bigger.
No, it had to be done into meetings that she will take for
Technical history.
retract to
Now, we've
herself.
got the reputation, it's one of these things that, I don't think it's like. Yeah, well,
So
that's,
she's got to
yeah, it's probably not.
It's gonna
We
be
have a
higher.
really simple model that we know works very well.
What I don't want to really out is put 5,000 hectares. You don't want to-
No,
You know what I mean?
It's not about that.
General, yeah.
And I do think that large.
Large
We're not thinking large financially or time scale, like on a.
Yeah, well, I don't think
time
there's
scale,
no existing anything
or-
like that.
What are doing,
Wouldn't it be community?
What about
the major strips or?
Yeah, he's got it.
What about the?
Something like that as well.
They've said, don't worry, like.
Yeah, that's the type of project.
A large meeting, the goal is what?
He can't do it the week after. And I just don't know.
They get some.
So something like that, so when you're saying fencing, it's.
Or it's like your regional parking lot.
See, if- but if
You're
you.
talking about pesticides.
I feel like a lot of the.
Pesticides. Not, okay, so it's not pesticides.
But if you back yourself, you're looking at the groups that want to.
Yeah, it's one of the.
And you've got, yep, your pest group doing something here. Now, to enable that pest group to enable their impact to be low, you've got to have somebody else doing pests next door. Otherwise, it's pointless. And you've got to have something.
But what you might do is give them, instead of $40,000, say, we'll tell
If
you.
somebody else is coming in behind.
It was over 3 years or something.
Like this.
So that
And then somebody
give them
else
that
is
security.
because all of these things are one group, they're done in isolation, and that's
What's the large scale Indian we haven't even looked at things.
It's the same thing, large scale landscapes.
The same
The same
thing,
thing.
yeah.
A lot of them.
Yeah.
And but
Contradictory.
the thing is, nobody's.
Landscape scale is complex, occasionally contradictory.
You could be like, because your landscape scale would be
biodiversity and it's not
Kelly. It's, you know, like you think about like the model.
So what we
Yeah,
need
but it's not something that
by
the community
large
goes to
scale,
and
what we
sees. It really helps the.
is that nobody's work is wasted.
We're aiming
Because it's
to
Think that
supported
the maximum
by
maximum species.
coming on around it,
Yes,
and
yeah,
underneath
Yeah,
it.
that's a good point.
And so it gets funded, when you look at their stuff and you go,
Don't
okay,
want to do projects in isolation.
exactly, and we're doing this bit now, are the other groups going to come in around it and make that thing work?
I'm not here to do Doc's job.
Yeah.
Something's a priority.
Yeah.
And this is where I'm gonna go
Does that
tomorrow.
make sense?
Discussion. I think we have to actually be really clear why.
Landscape, that's the last geographic area, that's what I'm talking about.
Absolutely fine to do stuff.
Landscape is geographic.
There's lots of them.
We're actually doing some stuff. And we need to be really clear about that when you.
That's probably my point about what's the difference
Yeah.
about being a council.
You've got to be able to go when you've got.
Yeah.
And I probably agree as well with you, but I'd
Yeah.
like to do that, but I think we've got a problem
Okay.
with regional
Yeah.
council.
Yeah, I didn't mean that project specifically. I just
Yeah.
don't know.
Yeah, yeah.
Large scale project.
The amount of people that impact it would be my.
Something.
Well,
But I don't know, 'cause
Yeah.
there's some things that.
And all those-
5 minutes, guys, and then we'll feedback.
Yeah, that's right.
What are we gonna do?
Very-
Well, you're doing it already. We know. It's absolutely fantastic work. Totally get and we support it.
Yeah.
But it should be a separate tick box that, and we acknowledge that we're doing it. And we do order as well. One thing about all of that is that Doc are not in the room in the discussion. And that just absolutely absent in the area. And that's what happens. It's
So
wonderful.
no differentiation between large scale.
But.
I would.
But
I think we do
Last one.
have to write down something that
And large, using
we
that.
can't do something.
That would be
isn't
useful
our-
for us in that
Yeah.
commission.
Yeah,
And we're
It's
not
not
saying
really
that
clear
that
what.
approach is-
well, that, and that
If it's your
becomes
land.
difficult when Doc withdraws
Right, okay,
from
so not on
Landscape scale.
conservation
Yeah.
land, but
Multiple stakeholders.
I think there's some of the
Well-
species where it can go, it's not on.
What have they got for large scale?
Okay.
I think
I think, yeah.
Basic
there can be an exception to it, if it hits 1, 2, or 3 of what we did before. As in, if there's a huge community, yeah.
No,
Yeah, that's too far.
yeah, and though we might think Doc should be doing this stuff, if Doc
Just stop with those two.
will, then what's gonna happen?
Although we have first point questions, so we don't have. Next two.
Yeah, there's a
No.
question. Right.
Yeah, like, protect the environment, aren't we? Like that.
Never happened if we all just on it.
Yeah, no, so it's not a simple,
It isn't a simple, and you have to have an exception basis for it.
So basically.
It should be driven by the 1, 2, or 3. So if you've got a community group that's been engaged around that, and that's why
When
I
you-
support Catholic.
So 1, 2, 3, meaning those two things, those three things, those
Yeah,
three.
yeah.
My worry is none of those say improve biodiversity or improve the environment.
And if they.
That was my first view to this.
No, no, but this is what you have in this definition, put these.
Don't know, no, you want to do that.
Yeah, so just basically, that was just more a reminder, people think about, but we can talk about that. Yes.
But that's why I say indirectly, is if it is just a community, like if it's not.
Okay,
like-
you guys ready?
For some of those educational.
Everyone ready?
Stuff for the
Yeah.
community.
Yeah,
Community stuff.
you're all good, huh?
People to connect with the environment and then that in turn will lead to them protect the environment hopefully more and stuff like that.
I'm gonna put
Okay,
measurable
conscious that
environment.
it's 3 o'clock already, so, and we'll have a break
Then the yellow tree.
very soon.
Large scales and much better with landscape.
Kate, does your group want feedback first this time?
We're a such a negative group, we've come up with things that it isn't, rather than things that.
Things that it isn't, sometimes that's
as powerful as things that it is. Did you have any differentiation between large scale?
We
and
hate
landscape
them.
scale?
We hated those words. We want to come up with a different word.
You don't
We
like the
want
word?
to limit ourselves by either the name. We want to focus on the outcome.
Yeah, we didn't want to assume that those are the correct terms for what we don't have to call it either of them.
If we were going to do landscape scale, we said that's geographically large in a number of communities, and it's got probably border issues, as in the issues will go over the border even of that area, and it will be at a substantial timescale.
So sorry, substantial time under landscape scale.
Oh, sorry, it's geographically large,
And geographically large.
and it probably have a number of communities. And it wouldn't fit into the eco fund. That's a negative. Just a normal eco fund, like
The general pool,
the general pool.
large scale.
Sorry, is that under landscape scale?
That was large scale, sorry.
So,
Either both we
Yeah,
have that.
kind of
We have
both.
so it doesn't align.
With the current
So
eco
it just
fund, general fund.
Falls under that, yeah.
Not specific funds.
Yeah, we also said it shouldn't be dock work there, unless it's an exception for 1, 2, or 3 of our previous answer in activity 1.
What do you mean? So it shouldn't, doc should be doing its own work, is that what you're saying?
Yep.
So it shouldn't be dock land. So it should be, is there a view on whether it's
No,
private
there's a
landowner?
dock, there can be dock land, but it shouldn't be a dock. Like, I mean, the example I'm going to give is an eco fund project, and that's Catlins and the bat work in there. We have literally funded Forest and Bird to do something that dock aren't doing themselves. Now, the problem with that is we could co-fund it or something, but we just have to be really careful that we're not going and doing something that dock or should be doing themselves. We need to, yeah.
I've got to express my hesitation
I've got to express mine in that
with
too.
that, because I just think we should be doing whatever's gonna have the biggest impact. And if DOC are, falling out of their things they should be doing, if they're never gonna do them, then what do we do? Like, who is gonna stand up and do them? And I think
That's
we
where
should
1,
be
2, or 3
thinking about
were the
it.
exceptions. So I said the exceptions were 1, 2, or 3. Yeah.
So does that go back to the collaboration part? That
Yes.
when we look at these projects, that DOC has to be in there?
Or the community have said it's so important to us that you have to do it. So that's exceptions.
Yeah.
So we'll have
You
to
don't
work
go
with
out
DOC
looking
to make sure it's doing its job. It's part of the collaboration.
Yeah.
We'll
Yeah,
have
I-
to.
I think-
Yeah.
I think
So would it
that's-
be fair to say that a feature of
But
what it
that's-
is collaborative, based on the
Yes.
3 things that you said
Yeah.
you want to achieve?
I think what it is, we're not doing it for DOC, we're doing it with DOC.
Exactly.
Or with other people.
Because our work will be
doing it.
hopeless if possums are still falling out of the trees all over the Catlins and into land that we've got groups trying to look
I
after.
think that's what that one pretty much is.
Anything else from your list, Kate, that either?
I mean, we just got the do not define or do not limit. We want it to be driven by the community, their visions and aspirations, and see what we can fund. Because that will naturally fall out from what your other stuff is. We thought there was, it's what you call it is compromises it almost the vision of the community.
So in the situation, back to some of the feedback and the themes around data in the conversation, if community driven or the level of community driving that happens, how you define or view it, do you align then the balance of what the community want, if that is not necessarily going to have good biodiversity outcomes or good value for money or seen as an efficient use of money?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you need a balance in that?
The only positive thing we actually all could agree on was it had to have measurable improved environment or measurable environmental improvements.
Yeah, and we sort of just
That are
talked about
enduring.
not saying like if we were to define large scale by saying, it has to be more than this many years or this many dollars or this specific, it has to be multiple entities working together or whatever. We don't want something to fall out of that just because it doesn't meet a specific criteria like that, but
Did not all come back to align to our strategic directions?
Well, yeah, that's why we like
Doesn't
activity
it
one better
all
than activity
Come
two.
back to that, yeah.
So, so at some point, from a say management perspective of Libby's team or whatever
Yeah.
model lands on, you're reviewing proposals, whether it's contestable or whatever model you put in. You will need some criteria still to
Yeah.
assess how things come out as higher value, right?
Yeah.
To make you, to guide your investment decision. So if say an example is, and this is in relation to Waikato's criteria, and we talked about them for them as an example. So they don't proactively fund things on dockland. But if they have two proposals that they can't separate for whichever reason, because based on their high level criteria, they will fit, it is likely that the one that wasn't on dockland may overall rate higher because their overall priority is to support private landowner driven community rather than dock.
Yeah.
So at some point, if you have to make a decision about where you invest, you're going to need, as vague as your criteria, as your definition might be, you will still need some criteria to make that decision to weed people out. Because one thing that has come through very strongly is you're not, because the scale and scope is so broad, you're not necessarily comparing apples with apples.
Yeah.
So what costs $100,000 in pest control is different to what you get $100,000 of water quality management, which is $100,000 difference to planting. So at some point, if you get 3 proposals, say, because that's the route you go down, and they're very different things, very different capability, very different communities, you have to have some way that you're going to determine who you might give money to or who you might not. So did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think from a community point of view as well, we need to give them some clarity.
Yes.
Rather than have everyone apply for this funding, because it could be anything. And then we say no to 500 groups, like that's not a good thing to do either. So we have to provide something.
And this is also then tied up with how we allocate that funding, because it may not be groups applying for money. It might be using our knowledge of what's really important, identifying what we want done. And I guess that first bit about aligning with strategic priorities, I'd even like to be a bit more specific about, I guess, aligning with our knowledge of where those environmental priorities in Otago are. That does relate to the whole mechanisms of strategic too.
We weren't particularly helpful in our 10 minutes is what I'm probably saying. We saw there's an ongoing discussion.
Yeah.
I wonder if we might have more helpful thoughts about this once we sort of have a funding model decided, like what criteria it's gonna be a lot clearer how that it's gonna work. Like, because I'm thinking about, how would this definition work for a contestable model versus a direct model, and I've got different thoughts
Yeah,
about.
and there's different criteria that each,
Other
group.
Just quickly, you're gonna have to be very careful when we start the funding model part of it, that we will not be able to please everyone and we will not be able to do everything. That's the scale of what we're doing. And I'll just go back to Richard shaking his head when we were going to lead everything. In fact, we just want to make sure we can get the money in and get people doing things, I would think. So we might give them.
I chatted and we clarified that there's a difference between leading the system development and leading the work.
That's right, exactly.
And so my comments were more around this leading the system.
Yeah, cool.
From a regulatory perspective and also from a strategic perspective, but the delivery side, not necessarily.
Yeah.
So thoughts from the other group?
Yeah, so we definitely don't want large defined by hectares, and we don't want landscape defined by hectares. So that's because, 50 hectares at Kekano Estuary, Tom, is huge.
With thousands of hectares.
Well, we've just been talking about a couple of it, but so what we're saying, so large will join multiple groups, and that's going back to our collaboration thing. So at the multiple groups, the same plan, same environmental goals. It's got to have multiple strands, multiple impacts, and a repeatable model. So if it becomes it would be really, really neat to get that money within a group that all of a sudden we can repeat that around areas, so we understand how those models work, and then we can repeat them. So that's not a definite one that has to work, but
So translatable as well? Translatable in terms of.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean by that. Yeah.
But it also capitalises on the different groups that might emerge in different areas without restricting them. So you can see that you've got a group doing that particular piece of work there. What other groups can come in around it to make sure that that piece of work is maintained into the very long term.
And I suppose
That's a feature of it.
just what we have got to be very careful of, though, is that we're just not putting funding another group that's doing the system and not actually ensuring the work's getting done.
There's groups there.
Yeah.
Can I start, we can get really confused in this, and I'm just going to put on a spanner. We've got the catchment action plans where we've got clear needs identified in each catchment. We haven't secured that funding yet either. And how much of this would be fitting into that? Because
So I think what we're saying, if you take it, give it a Catlin's context.
Yeah.
It's like getting your weeds people and your pest people and
Yeah.
your other people all working together, so you actually, because you do any one thing in isolation, you're not going to get an outcome.
You're not gonna get you're not getting an ecosystem level outcome.
So you're doing
What
ecosystem's a good word.
Yeah.
But that's your collaboration being
And
like,
I think,
ability
Kate, what
to
you're saying is we'll get
get
into that
big change.
discussion around the model, because that's the delivery mechanism. You know, in terms of the catchment action plans.
It's also our funding issue though,
Yeah.
is that we haven't bedded that down. We've got a work stream which is doing the planning, but we haven't got the funding stream to go with
The
a really good
implementation.
process.
Yeah.
And I just want to put it out there that that's the other frustration we've got. Yeah, there's quite an important conversation going on around whether we fund the system or we fund the work essentially as well. And I don't know if we have to do a black and white on that,
I
but
think that's a good point.
yeah, that's where I'm, yeah.
That in terms of the examples, and I know there's not a huge amount of detail in the notes pack, but we can talk about it if we need to in questions, is that the Auckland model particularly is an and or it's not a one or the other, that they've made a very conscious decision in their grant funding strategy and the way that they're divvying up their money to directly fund under their definition of large scale, high priority, high environmental risk and impact pieces of work directly with well-established providers. They have a contestable portion, which they are very clear what they will and won't fund, and they fund a person who is a community connector coordinator. And there is an element of everything they fund that has a component of evaluation, education, research, and system development, kind of governance, training, and all that sort of stuff. So there are people doing it out there. So I think it's right. It's not we invested all in projects or we invested all in the system. You've got the ability within this money, and that's why we sort of put the question, is it $2 million a year? Is it $6 million over 3 years? Are there bits that you do different things with? Because it doesn't have to be just a one thing.
Yeah.
But I suppose how you then interpret, given that your wording in the LTP is large scale, what does and what it doesn't mean. And some of that you can defer to a set criteria later on, in which the examples from those other councils are there. But also establishing in your mind, so you can do the elevator pitch of this is what large scale means to us. And I think you're getting there. It's maybe my interpretation is there's worrying about the words as opposed to the intent. But is there anything else from your group?
I think putting catchment in there, catchment scale is helpful if we're looking for consistency.
Right, we're gonna,
So catchment, are you ready? Do you think we're ready for a break?
we need a break, we'll have a break for 10,
10 minutes?
and then we're coming back with,
Sorry, Lobby, can you just go to the next slide? I just want to see what's on the next one. Oh, yeah. So that's just the discussion bit. And then I think, yes. So if we have a break now, then we'll go into the funding model
yeah.
discussion.
Thank you, Kate, for your very.
That was so hard.
Discussion.
I think I've actually done it in a way that you can read it, but it doesn't mean
No,
much.
that's good.
This year.
Welcome back to the workshop, and we're just starting on, we're just about to start looking at the 6 different funding models. Emma's just gonna give us a brief rundown now.
Great, thank you. So this is probably the quite meaty part of the discussion, and purposefully we did the other discussion first so that we've got front of our minds, particularly those 3 things that you want to achieve out when looking at the funding models, relating it back to that. And I know there's a lot of information in the pre-reading. Some of the slides have been updated a little bit based on the information, and a few errors picked up, which we've amended. So essentially I won't go through all of the SWOT analysis under each model in detail, because there's a lot of information about that. I've got a couple of summary slides for each one, and then really want to use it as a discussion around each of those models to have as a group, answer any questions that you might have, things that might not be clear, any questions you might have around some of the other stakeholders or other models that we looked at, without going into, you know, huge detail. But essentially just a quick recap from some of the information, and we have also given out an A3 sheet, which is a consolidated view of all of the SWOT for all of the models together, so you can easily compare and contrast. But essentially just some key points that came up and from the research and the stakeholder work was around how contestable funding models are quite resource and time intensive, very expensive to administer, short-term view of funding, so a short cycle like annual funding, and particularly some requirements around that type of funding can drive a lot of obviously competition and a focus on providers needing to think of new things to do rather than maintaining. Quite hard balancing transparency and accountability for giving money, and how the process you give out with environmental outcomes, because as we know, achieving environmental outcome is not a 1-year thing, it's over a much longer term. That when I'm saying here, ORC and the sector need to be ready for the model, it's kind of having the wider support systems and structures, or the process to get to that point in place will need to occur. And providers said to us, you know, if they could ask one thing, they just didn't want an application form to be released with an expectation they replied, you know, quickly, that they would like to have some time to work up to something, depending on what, you know, large scale meant. Leveraging additional investment is harder than it sounds. That's come through from a lot of people, that what the best intentions in theory were haven't played out as well. Hindsight's a wonderful thing. The impact of the investment will be greater where the model allows for continued ORC leadership, and that's of the system, not on the delivery, just clarifying that other point earlier. And in a lot of the models where there have been some of the allocation and decision making has been able to be driven at a senior management level or at a level of people close to knowing what's happening on the ground. It's probably a summary of that. Oh, sorry, Kate.
Okay, so I'm umbrage that people who are elected wouldn't know what was happening on the ground, but that's okay. No, that's not, I just want to check, can we just go back, the leveraging. What I have found is that leveraging, as long as it's leveraging dollars is hard, leveraging involvement is less hard, and it's how we account for their contribution. And I think anyone in Central would, over the COVID area, appreciate the work, and it was told to us by a number of groups that OJ Hacker, for example, took on, and some of that their co-funding. So it's acknowledgement of co-funding as opposed to dollars, and I'm just want to test that against you with your research, and whether do we have to be co-funding? If we acknowledge co-funding, has it been hard to leverage, or is it the actual dollar matching that's been hard?
Both.
Okay.
And I think probably if you're putting it into the council context, so say some of these models are looking at a lot of the funding or investment being driven from the centre as such in terms of a partnership with council, say, most of the experience of other councils is it's far easier for your community groups to leverage philanthropic investment, corporate investment, co-funding arrangements than it is for a council as the entity to
Oh,
do that.
sorry, yeah. Okay, I've
So probably
misunderstood
from
you.
that perspective, but also the models around leveraging cash, getting more cash is hard.
Yeah.
No matter where it's coming from, whether it was coming from another TA, from a philanthropic partner or a corporate sponsor, just the environment at the moment is hard to get money. So it kind of means multitude of things really. So in terms of the 6 models, and I won't go into this in detail, but they were things that came out from the last workshop and things that we've seen. 6 key ones, looking at the contestable structure, whether that was an upscale eco fund or something new, a direct type of funding model, bringing in the catchment action plans and the biodiversity priorities is looking at that as that implementation side of the planning. The administering of a fund to a third party, so whether that was to administer your money or to try and raise other money to then administer with yours. The collaborative or the co-funded or sort of the joint venture type model where multiple funds come together and it all gets allocated out. And then, or it was funded through an existing organisation, and then establishing something new and standardised. So they are the things that we've looked at. A lot of the academic evidence around the effectiveness of those was in the pre-reading pack and some of the evidence and research. And then some of the discussion here is really looking at this from a practicality perspective, looking at the strengths, the opportunities, some of the weaknesses and the risks for for the model in the ORC context. And also some of the financial and operational things that you might have to consider. Now, looking at these from the context of this is your long-term end game, it might be that you need more than one model over a 5-year period to get to where you want to get to. But if we're looking at it from an intergenerational impact, a collaborative approach and aligning with strategy, this is the frame I suppose we want you to take the conversation from. So, and this is in the pre-reading pack. I'm just kind of prefacing some of what we do next with the matrix. So really the point that of the discussion where we want to get to is to be able to objectively assess based on some of the information you've got and the discussion that we have, what you think each of the models is going to take in terms of the risk to the organisation or, you know, a multitude of things, the value that it might bring, the cost involved and the effort required. And there is a slide in the pre-reading, and I've got it on the next slide too, around how we define those, of what they might mean from the context of this work. And it's a way that we can kind of start to guide some of the decision making around what things might be more effective or better to investigate further than others, thinking it from a long-term perspective. And when we get to looking at this in more detail and actually mapping them out, looking at it from being, you know, things in a quadrant rather than sitting on the line. So in terms of the definitions and, you know, risk is really that level of risk to council. So it could be a multitude of things, relationship risk, loss of money, risk to achieving your intended goals or outcomes. And it could also relate to the risk of, you know, overall effectiveness in the delivery or implementation. And this could extend to, you know, the risk to communities of, you know, being able to achieve what you're asking them to achieve. The value is around the economic value that it can bring, but it also can be around the environmental value as well. The cost is in terms of both the investment to stand it up, operate it, administer it, and some of the ongoing cost implications that you might have to look at, such as, you know, how thin you might spread your investment. And your effort is, and the effort sort of quadrant is related to, you know, in the long term, the quantity and the quality of resources is good. You're going to need to, you know, to operate and function in the long term as well. And it's things like what might be needed in within the organisation and or outside it as well. So that's sort of the frame of that. And the quadrants we'll use, and we've also got some A3 sheets of it we'll hand out as well, and it's in the pre-reading pack, is really looking at once we get to the end of it today, what are those models that you might want to avoid? Yes, there's just 4 of them. Because they might be really high cost, high risk, or have a lower value. The ones that you want to consider that might take low effort, low cost, or might be low risk, but there's still some unknowns around it. What's quite clear that you want prioritised, and they will be the ones that we will jump to in the next phase to look at in more detail. And then those ones that you might want investigated more. And that might be that they rank quite highly across all the areas, but you think from a long-term perspective, they've got more risk than, more reward than risk. And then we can, once we get to that point, we can discuss and make a decision on ones we go into further, and if there's any that are that you want discounted straight away. So that's sort of the context that we'll get to after we've talked about the models. And this is the matrix here, which you would have seen from the reading pack as well, and that Livy's just handed around too. So, and I mentioned before, you know, really we want to talk about the end game of where you want to get to in the long term, but I did want to flag from some of the discussions and from some of the research, what a likely timescale is for some of those models to keep in the back of your mind. So obviously there's some that you can do more quickly than others, and there's some that are going to take a long time. So back to your question earlier, Kate, some of those councils where they have either facilitated, supported, or gone ahead at setting up their own trust and or separate organisation, their experience was 10 kind of years to get to the point of bringing the partners together, getting additional money, and some of them haven't achieved that yet after a significant period of time. So those things will be obviously more your long term, because you're looking at setting up entities, constitutions, trustees, all of those sorts of things. Some fall into a couple depending on how far you take them as well. So that is just sort of to give you an indication. So this really, under each of the models, I've just got a slide on each, just summarising the information that you've all had. And it's really an opportunity to have a discussion around each of those models. Any questions? Any questions that you might have, any comments that you want to make? You've got the SWOT stuff in front of you as well from each of those. And any thoughts or questions, really? Sort of.
Can I, sorry, just to clarify the timescale, you're talking about the time it takes to get them running optimally.
Yes.
Yeah. Obviously, they can be up and running a lot quicker
Yes.
than 6 years or 3.
Yeah, I mean, I think to run optimally, yes. I think if you were looking at the setting up an independent entity and or going into a partnership type arrangement with somebody already looking to co-invest, there is the ground, from what others have told us, the groundwork to take that up. So as an example, Taranaki, they had one full-time staff member. His job was basically to set up the trust that they did, and he said you have no idea how many hours that took.
Yeah, I understand that. I guess it's just, there's a big difference between saying it's going to take 6 years to even have it running versus it will take 6 years to be running in the optimum way.
Yes.
So just so we understand that.
Yeah.
Alex,
Can I just ask about the model? I'm not quite understanding the RVCE model with the effort. So something that's low effort but high risk you'd avoid, but something that's high effort and high risk you'd investigate?
Yes, I read a lot of the stuff around the mate, because when I first looked at this, I was like, oh, that seems back to front to me. The effort scale seems back to front. And I think contextually, when you read the evidence around the model, it's taking it from the point that while it might take high effort, sometimes with high effort can come high reward as well. So my immediate view of looking at was I thought those were the wrong way around. But when you read some of the research behind the development of the model, and I suppose it's how you interpret and define effort as well, that high effort can also align sometimes with high value. So yes, it's a good question.
High cost and high risk.
I struggled with it, yeah.
I struggled with that too.
Tom?
So just with that, where does the existing eco fund model fit into that matrix?
I haven't assessed it. That would be an interesting,
I'm just wondering if we need to change it at all. That's all.
So I think the idea is that we're going to go through each one individually, and then as we're going through, you might be able to ask that question for them.
yes, and I
you-
suppose.
And just get in your own mind as you're going through where it may rank.
Yeah, and I suppose the purpose of this isn't necessarily to look at the existing eco fund process and money in relation to this. It's really looking at the contestable funding model as that if you were going to take this new 2 million and set it up as an extension of the eco fund, where would it rank? As opposed to looking at the current, because the current criteria and the current process for the eco fund is completely kind of standalone and separate at the moment. This is just looking at the large scale portion of that. The large scale new investment. So in terms of the first model, and you've got the SWOT stuff in front of you. It's really just a discussion around your thoughts, any questions that you might have, anything that you want to add to that, and we'll just go through each of the models before we then talk about the assessing and the matrix. If you are looking for, I'll just skip ahead a few. There was some questions in the pre-reading pack to help prompt the discussion. If I can find them. That we did put at the back. So if you want to refer to those as some starting points, keen to obviously discuss things like how the model relates to the things that you're trying to achieve in the long term and the impact that you want to have, how it might align to your thoughts around what large scale is and isn't, how you might know if you're achieving the outcomes with that model, if you think there's anything missing, if there's any surprises, or questions around some of the financial and operational implications. And then we'll get into some of that high-low in terms of the cost and value stuff soon. I know there's a lot of information there.
So we're going to go through each one.
Yep, so if we just start with the first model and we will take some notes around the discussion, and if there's any questions that anybody has around that, we can work through that. But I suppose keen on people's thought, like general overview, thoughts and discussion before we go into the assessment.
I suppose, so asking for thoughts on that first model.
The first model, yes, yeah.
I, at this stage, so open to changing my mind, would strongly oppose using that contestable model. You've given those reasons there. I think it can work for the eco fund, where we largely have mostly small projects and community groups, empowerment, those groups do all this stuff. It doesn't allow the council to think about, well, really in an organised way to say, look, here's priority environmental work that we want done. And I hope that new fund is going to allow us to do that, as well as the contestable models bring so many problems for community groups trying to use them, because they don't have the continuity of funding and they have to put so much effort into the application forms that are completely different funding models. So I'm hoping we are not going to go down that track. Thanks.
Ditto.
Any other questions?
I mean, this one's reasonably self-explanatory in terms of some of the strengths, and it allows you to move quite quickly on things and get some money out the door potentially. But it does, as you say, Councillor Somerville, have some other weaknesses and strengths, and certainly from the stakeholder feedback and discussion, the people on the ground were reasonably opposed to council implementing a model like this as well, for those very things that we've identified. You know, what's in these SWOTs is really based on what some of the academic evidence says, what stakeholders have told us, and the experience of other councils we've asked the councils we've talked to, you know, if you could do it again today, what would you do? What are your learnings? What are some of the challenges you've experienced or the opportunities that have been created? So
It's good. We've got Gretchen and then Elliot.
Before we talked about whether or not we might have to do a transitional approach to the way that we set this up, so that we're aiming towards something, but say next year or the year after, we may not be quite there yet. If, for example, and I'm not saying we won't, but let's say we decided we were going to do direct funding straight away, as local government, we can't really just do that without some form of contestable.
Yes.
You know, it happens at annual plan time or something, like it ends up being contestable, I think. I can't imagine how it wouldn't, somehow. Yeah, so I agree that contestable isn't ideal, but because of the interest in the fund and the fact that it's only 2 million and there's probably multiple large scale projects going across our region that all would like that money, the realities are that somehow there would probably be contestable.
and I think where that comes in, say for the Auckland example and for Waikato as well, is under a definition, the criteria of what it is and isn't, and Waikato views it as a self-assessment tool. So providers can look and say, actually, I will or won't apply because I know I can't meet these requirements. So it's contestable to a degree, like you say, rather than council shoulder tapping certain people. But if the definition is based on if you're very clear around what you will and won't, what you want to invest in, then there is some parameters.
So, yeah, that you would make the criteria, I'd imagine.
Okay, so that's probably what we're doing, the development criteria before. What's going on? Elliot?
Yeah, I guess on Gretchen's point, we've done some small direct funding stuff in the past, though, even at a pilot scale, and I don't know how that works.
Free to need.
Yeah, but sorry, I'm sure look at that in the next section, but I was just gonna ask around so that was the side that I guess provided a small first of all, with the Eco Fund, if we decide to not use any of this fund that we're talking about today to boost the Eco Fund in any way, is that large scale section of the Eco Fund still going to happen as it has in past years?
Yes, it's still included at the moment. I guess we'd need to rethink that when we can develop up different criteria. If there's already a fund that covers large scale, we might not need it. So but it is included, that 300,000 is included in the long-term plan.
Yeah. So that's not relying on anything with these decisions or anything. Yeah, just because I guess I pretty much completely agree with what Alan said, although just sort of reflecting that there has been some really cool and impactful projects that have come through that Eco Fund, and maybe they'll just end up in a direct funded model or something, but just wanting to reflect that some of the stuff that has come through is really cool, and I'd be happy to even spend some portion of this funding pool in boosting the Eco Fund to make that more effective.
So really, I suppose this model is looking at using, in the large scale context, setting up a contestable fund as opposed to putting some of your 2 million back into Eco Fund. So it's looking at the administering of your large scale tagged 2 million. This option is looking at setting it up as a contestable model. So it could be set up similar to how the Eco Fund operates by now. And I mean, from that perspective, you may use the same grant process of how people apply. You may use some similar accountability. You may use a slightly different criteria. You may run it at the same time as the Eco Fund. Because essentially from the model perspective, taking the 2 million that you've got tagged for large scale, using it as a contestable fund, and your amounts might be different and your time scale might be different to the Eco Fund, and the type of project might be different. But essentially, I suppose the important part here is it's a contestable, open on the market, anyone can apply type of approach, as opposed to some of the other approaches which are potentially quite different.
But there's nothing stopping us from taking some percentage of the funding we're talking about today and just directly investing that in the Eco Fund and boosting up by that amount.
I don't believe that there is anything stopping you doing that. If that's your
It would need a separate discussion through this was tagged specifically through the long-term plan for a different purpose.
Yeah.
So there would need to be a process that we went through to reallocate the amount of funding within the existing Eco Fund and what we've termed in the long-term plan as a large-scale environmental funding. So they have been discussed with the community as two different things. So we just need to go through a process if you was looking to boost supplement one by reducing this one.
Yeah.
But it doesn't take
going
be
to the large scale of the Eco Fund.
Yeah.
Right.
different things. Yeah.
I'm just going to move on to the next
Yeah, can
one.
I'll
Because
just say something quickly. I
oh,
think,
sorry.
yeah, I think we just like we don't fall down too far into it right now.
Yeah.
Really what we're going through, we just want to make sure we've got a good understanding of the 6 different options. And then the game plan is, by the end of today, is to come up with 2 or 3 options to investigate further, to take them further. So we, at this stage, we're sort of we got a level higher perhaps, maybe. And so, yeah, so I think we just go through and just get a good interpretation of what each fund is about, make sure we're clear on it, and then move on to the next one.
Sorry, Lloyd,
Thank you.
I suppose and I agree with what you're trying to do there, but to me, I've only got one choice. I've made up my mind already, but which is number 6. But it's a matter of how we actually get to there, because I think if you're actually wanting to get somewhere environmentally and get the numbers and get the support from everywhere else, that's what you've got to actually get to. So
I think if we can just go through each
so,
one,
yeah,
so we
we got-
understand each one, and have the big
I
discussion.
know, but so what I want to find out somewhere is the time frame that you're looking at. If you're going to start rating, there's an option to start rating this year. I think that was our long-term plan. We start rating this year, whether we rate the 2 million or a lesser sum or whatever we decide to do, is when we actually want to start using that money and getting it out will determine how I would set these models up initially. But I've got number 6, and I'll explain at some stage later why
Yes.
number
Yes.
6 is the optimum.
So I think that's good. I think as I understood it, the idea was to try and decide right now what our long game is, and then if we decide like number 6, then we'll go to the discussion as how we how we move to get there.
So I might go through these a little bit quicker so we can get on to that discussion and the ranking of each of them. So if there is anything people want clarified through each of the models before we go to the assessment, maybe we'll do it that way, because conscious of time as well.
Yeah.
There is some more detailed information in the pre-reading around our interpretation of each of those models, or what they would potentially look like in operation as well. So that direct kind of funding, or the EOI, similar as, Gretchen's already raised the element of contestability that still needs to exist as well, how that might work. There is obviously, as we outlined in the strengths and opportunity stuff, some collaborative advantages that a slightly less contestable model can have in terms of, fully contestable process. You can't engage with the community groups and delivery partners potentially, but through more direct funding process or a criteria that weeds out some people for a start, that may not be best aligned with what you're trying to achieve, that does open some opportunities there.
So that would be in line with our current site-led funding, direct group funding for site-led projects?
That's more in line with option 2.
Yes.
Yeah, that's what he's talking, yeah.
So we've got that one sorted, so we can move on to option 3.
The third one is picking up the challenge around the catchment action plans and then the implementation of those. So using your large scale money to basically support the implementation of the catchment action plans, which obviously then has some strong links to your community activation engagement and your biodiversity priorities for each of those communities. And obviously that's what, again, we've outlined some of the strengths and opportunities there, as well as some of those challenges. The fourth one is really looking
So
at,
that's pretty much complementing the integrated catchment
Yeah.
planning system.
Mhm.
As opposed to
using-
biodiversity
using the money as funding some of the delivery, the implementation of those
outcomes.
yeah. of those outcomes
Yeah.
and the biodiversity strategy.
So the reason you've got the time frame there is 3 to 5 because because that's our time frame on our caps, as opposed to.
Yes, and
Because we
also
could do it in tranches. I mean, we've got some going now.
you could do some
Yeah.
now, but I suppose that's if you were going to use that, the evolution of getting
Yeah.
that work done could be 3 to 5 years of having.
The tranches of what
Yeah.
we're doing,
Yeah.
that's what's driving it.
Yeah. The administration of the fund by a third party. Now, this could be a shorter time frame or longer time frame, depending on how it works. So it could involve contracting another charitable trust or entity, which could be your CCO. How that aligns with their strategy and their core business is something for part of the discussion. And also whether you're giving them the money to administer on your behalf through a grant process is a slightly different model to them trying to also leverage other money on your behalf as well. So, and there's a lot of detail in the notes, and this is the model that the Christchurch Foundation and Environment Canterbury went down. I suppose the other really important thing as part of this is there is no models that we've found where council has given their money to another entity to then distribute grants on their behalf. It's usually been council has funded an entity to undertake some administrative stuff on their behalf, like source other investment or support a delivery partner to do some work, as opposed to taking money that's to be allocated for a grant, giving it to a separate entity completely outside of council to administer in isolation. Does that make sense? So the example of this would be, say you gave your $2 million to Port Otago, and Port Otago made a criteria and set a panel and gave out grants for environmental work on your behalf. Yep.
Sorry. Just to clarify, this would still require a decision on whether that was contestable or direct, or how that was given out, right?
Yes, but in this instance, you could probably assume that you've got a contract with that entity to do that, and they would do that on your behalf.
So they'll make that decision. Okay.
So that's where it feeds into the risks and challenges of some of that stuff. And some of those models have been tried. Because essentially you're removing the internal capacity requirement from the organisation as part of that. The collaborative or joint.
Sorry, just on that.
Yes, sorry.
So you're indicating in the detail that there'd be about a 10% cost that would be associated with that. So that would mean the $2 million fund would diminish either by that, but you'd also thought that maybe the administrative costs could be met internally by ORC sources. But then wouldn't you still have the administrative cost by the third party, the other party?
Yeah.
And then there would still be a cost, because there'll still be some ORC or staff involvement that's going to sit alongside it too. So it potentially becomes quite a high cost option.
Potentially, and that's the example of why, putting all this stuff on the table, that probably a lot of the feedback or key learnings from other councils is if you take some of the admin internal capacity and give it to somebody else, you still are accountable for ratepayer money. So you still need to monitor the contract or the agreement that you have with your third party to make sure they're delivering what they said they were going to do, because the risk becomes higher. If they don't perform, it's ratepayer money that somebody else has been responsible for. So yes, you're correct that while you might reduce some overhead costs internally, because you might have a staff member sitting in a trust running the process for you, you'll still need somebody in ORC managing the performance of that third party.
Plus also then have agreement when that third party comes back with the decision, knowing that, does council agree with that or not?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
The collaborative sort of co-funded model, and this could this could look like different versions of things. It's not necessarily one thing. It could be a shared service agreement that you have with your other local authorities to put your biodiversity money together and make collaborative decisions around how you allocate it. Or it could be with a philanthropic or a separate entity or a trust. Or DOC, yeah.
Do you see that as like, it could be like several partnerships or?
I think it could
Okay.
potentially evolve over time. To have more partners, and certainly some of those alliance type models that are operating started off and brought in more partners over time.
You might start off with one with a TA or one with Whenua or one with Tyndall or somebody like that. Do you see over time, do you see it as like three separate entities that you'll be working, or is it like create a mega partnership?
I think it's all dependent on the relationship, the partnership, the priorities, what people want to invest in. I think that's probably where some of the challenge has come with these types of models, as those other organisations, whether they're a local authority or a government department or a philanthropic investment, they have their own priorities, their own potentially legislative mandate, their own donors, bequesters who decide, who direct where investment's going to go. So it really is an alignment of values and priorities, I think, and opportunities at the time. I don't think necessarily anything always lasts forever either. It will be.
Have you got any examples of that one?
Yes, but not in this strict. So one of the examples that actually came up was around the regional council arrangement for software, because it is a shared service arrangement. So it's completely outside the environmental context.
Yeah.
But there are models like that. Some of the other ones that are collaborative, they are not necessarily tied to money. So the Alliance on the top of the South Island has got a lot of partners. They have an MOU. They're all working very closely together. There's small amounts of administrative money they're pooling together to pay for a person, but they're not giving out any money to fund grants as such.
Okay, you know,
Well, it's interesting, in having had some experience, I would almost say predator-free Dunedin, which was 27 identities, and then the TAs coming in on board, would have been a collaborative co-funded or joint venture model. And interestingly, talking to them, they're really happy with how that worked and rolled out and was effective. But if the large funding from predator-free 2050 was no longer available, they'd probably disband. Talking to some of them, not necessarily all of them, because it also stifles their competitive bidding for money. So it really is a time, and it's what is set up and available that sometimes determines how effective they are long term.
Yeah, and to be honest, predator-free Dunedin we haven't spoken with yet. They're still on our list in a couple of weeks. We haven't had our meeting with them yet. Yeah.
And it would depend which member you talk to, what they feel about it.
Yeah.
so Helen and then Alexa.
Yeah, thanks. Look, I'm just trying to work out in my mind where particular arrangements would sit under this classification. For instance, you know, these umbrella organisations or alliances who actually coordinate the work of a whole lot of other local organisations. If we were to say to them, here's to one of them, here's $500,000, and we know we want you to carry on with this biosecurity and biodiversity work, but you sort out how you devolve that amongst the groups who work with you. Would you see that as the sort of direct funding, or is that joint venture, or is it more of a mix?
I have put one of the examples under the joint in the reading pack. Just which model did I put it under? I think it is under, yes. So the example, and probably a lot of what we've found is a lot of those collaborative type arrangements is council funding a delivery partner as opposed to and having a collaborative relationship in that way rather than then. So if you give the example, say somebody like Southern Lakes Sanctuary, the collaborative would be, they would receive funding to then pass on for delivery in the community. And they would report to you on how that was being spent or how that was being used. So that model is probably happening more in practice around the country. And even from those trust or incorporated society structures that councils have gone and set up, those trusts and entities that they've set up haven't been set up to give out money. They've been set up to lead delivery at a community level. As opposed to then giving, say, Southern Lake Sanctuary money to then give out through a contestable or grant type process. Most of it is at that relationship kind of level. Yeah.
Thanks.
Alexa?
I was wondering, you mentioned earlier about how nothing lasts forever, and I'm wondering if we look to a progression. It seems like some of these ones that have some that can be done reasonably short term, perhaps, you know, model 3 via the catchment or model 4. Things that can be done reasonably short term could eventually evolve into more advanced models like 6, which I think are too expensive to set up in the beginning and will take too long. I think our community is going to want something quicker. But do you see a way of them evolving over time, the models?
Yeah, I think so. And probably the point that I would make, certainly from talking with others, is the evolution is dependent on the strength of the trust and the partnerships that continue to evolve and happen over time, would be probably, and that kind of ongoing commitment. And that's where some of the challenge of keeping the models going long term and continuing on that path of evolving when they are aligned to LTP processes. So great things that have started with, say, the intention of multiple local authorities to come together, and as LTPs progress and challenge around rates and cost pressure, some councils drop in and out, and so things that were intended at the time 10 years later haven't necessarily ended up that way, but that's just the way it is.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexa. Go.
One of the things that I think may come out of these groups, but I'm not quite sure if it's an opportunity or an operational implication, or whether we just say it's a nice to have, but don't put it under the scene, is feedback on our statutory and regulatory role, or at the capacity that doing this at scale gives community groups to drive, say, the regional pest management plan to be changed, or that gives an impetus for government to change their funding models as well. Look, if I took Wild and Conifer group, if we didn't have the Central Otago and the other groups feeding in, we probably wouldn't have had the noise on the ground that got the government funding on wild trees, for example. And I just want to acknowledge that strength of in some of these, the way we set these up, to be able to give that feedback and to complete the loop of what the frustrations for many small groups are sometimes that they can't get that noise to get that statutory or regulatory change, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And same, if I think about predatory Dunedin and the noise they went to and possibly didn't quite achieve to get access to people who don't care about cats being on their property and that sort of stuff. And I don't know where I'd put it. I'm just putting it there that we should be looking at setting up something that works that way as well.
Yeah, and I think that comes down again to some of that partnership and relationship and the collaboration that happens, that some of the collaboration can happen and grow and develop without a funding model being in place to necessarily support it. It's how it all feeds in together, I think. I'll just quickly jump to the last one because I'm conscious that we're of time. So this one is, I suppose, your potential Rolls-Royce long-term of having a separate entity, and certainly from what we heard last time was the option to look at this as a model where council would essentially put the 2 million maybe in escrow for the trust, and you would have the ability to leverage additional money, or the trust would allocate out. And there is a couple of models that we have looked at, and it's only been in the last couple of days really. So Hawke's Bay went down this track, very complicated model of an incorporated society and a charitable trust. And Wild for Taranaki is the other kind of example. What they intended when they outset and what's happening on the ground now are quite different. And they were the two examples in terms of the long-term nature of it's taken to get to this point. The Alliance in the Top of the South isn't a legal entity. It is just an MOU across organisations. They don't have any legal standing whatsoever, and they don't have any money to give out. So I suppose the real question that this model comes back to in the short term is, what is the value of it? If it's taking 2 million and sitting it in a completely different entity and then giving out 2 million, what is the advantage of doing that? Would be my key question, given that they have to have trustees and you have to have a deed and a constitution and separate accounts and all those things that you're required to if you have a standalone organisation. So the other things, but then again, there is potential long-term benefit through having a separate entity if and when you can access additional money. As an example, from the Hawke's Bay, the original trust was set up with money in escrow that was to grow over time. The money hasn't grown, and the incorporated society is funded by the escrow money from the trust. And so it's a very expensive and governance heavy model of money going literally and around in a big circle from the council to the trust, the incorporated society, and then reporting back to council. So I think for this model, while it has a lot of advantages, one of the things I just urge you to think about is what is the value of us having that potentially in the short term, sort of based on some of Alexa's comments early on. So I just wanted to touch on this quickly as well, because there's sorts of models, and I'm not saying that a sort of model is necessarily right. We've picked kind of 6 clear ones that we could kind of assess against, then looked at examples. There is some stuff happening with Nature Conservancy and the New Zealand Nature Fund, but not possibly how it's interpreted by the environmental community of what's actually happening. The Top of the South Alliance, Nature Conservancy, that is not a long-term thing and there is a transition plan in place for them to come out of that model. And probably what we still haven't really found clear, and like I said, there's still a group of stakeholders for us to talk to, is a partnership where there is council and an iwi entity or runanga, that there's co-funding and investment of allocating money out, or where there's a philanthropic fund and a council jointly putting money into the pot and then allocating out. There are little bits and pieces happening, but they're happening quite separately of each other. Where there's, say, that trust that's just giving out money because there is the element of the trust is for the purpose of a delivery agent. So there's a lot of examples like that. And then also the other thing is in the context of large scale. So a lot of the investment, even in these other entities, it's $40,000-$50,000 a year. It's not big money.
So in your stakeholder engagement, have you talked to Perpetual Guardians or Otago Community Trust or Southland Community Trust and asked them, do they have a environmental role that they want to fulfill, and B, would they find it helpful to any of these models?
So we've talked to Wakatipu Community Foundation. We've spoken to them. Otago Community Trust is later this week because Gemma's been away, so I haven't been able to talk to her earlier. So as an example, Wakatipu Community Foundation are looking to and have been supporting some environmental investment. They have been administering under that third party model the money through I Love Wanaka and I Love Queenstown, but it's just passed through. They're not putting their own money in. And the challenge from them, speaking from their experiences, most of those trusts and entities have a geographic mandate in their constitution that they adhere to. And so finding somebody that covers all ORC potentially is challenging. And a lot of their priorities and investment decisions are driven by the wishes of bequests and donors, as opposed to them just having money to play with and say, this is now our priority. Some of the North Island councils have tried it in the past and have found that it has become challenging because those organisations are their own entities in their own right and will make their own strategy and funding and investment decisions based on their own identified priorities. So they may align with councils at some point in time, and then other years they don't.
So would I be, if I take that question slightly further, and Perpetual Gardens is interesting, or any of those ones who do wills and long-term trust or short-term, would I be right in suggesting that the boundary for some of those things would be better at a catchment scale rather than at an Otago regional scale. Would be that would align better with some of those, the way those other trusts are set up.
Potentially, yeah. So say you had a catchment, an action plan in, say, the Central Lakes area.
Yeah.
At a community scale, if that was being funded, there is probably an opportunity for a discussion that maybe ORC with Central Lakes Trust in terms of how could we collaborate to support this work locally, as opposed to at an ORC level, how do we grow the $2 million pot and find someone who our value proposition is so strong with them that they're going to throw us some other money, for want of a better term. So just sort of want to get into the last activity, and we can do this still as two groups, or if it's more value as a whole group. I'll let be guided on Rich and Lloyd in terms of this. But really this is, I suppose, where we look at what's in those SWOTs, the discussion that we had, and start to look at the matrix in terms of where you would place them. And I mean, where you place them kind of based on some of the information you might have without running detailed scenarios in your head of, well, if this happened and that happened, and in 5 years' time, if we were here, would we still rate it here? So I'm not saying do it quick and dirty, but it's probably trying to get to is there ones that resonate, or is there ones that by looking at it now on paper you kind of go, no, I don't think that's really where we want to go to based on what we want to achieve.
Yeah, I think that's good. What could we exclude is just as helpful as, because from here, the team are going to have to go away and provide you a lot more detail about what the implementation of these options would look like. And based on that, if they are going to take some time, what are some hybrid considerations you've got around the rates we are proposing to rate for from the 1st of July 20 this year, and whether we carry on in that vein or take a different approach. So there is quite a bit of work to do, and the idea today is to get that down to a more manageable level than doing that for 6 options.
Yeah.
So what we can exclude is just as important as sort of talking about the things that look good.
So we're just going to put
I think
1 to
perhaps
6 on that graph.
I think it worked pretty good going to our groups of those other
Yeah.
ones. I think we're going quickly into our groups and have a square.
Yeah.
What do you
So
think?
we've given out a couple A3 sheets with the matrix on it, so you don't have to keep going back to the slides. And I would use it in your groups to mark up 1 to 6. The questions which we put in the pre-reading, I'll leave that slide up to prompt some of your thoughts around that. If you need to refer back to the definition, again, around the criteria and what each quadrant means, it's in your pre-reading pack as well. And I think if we sort of spend 15 minutes on this and then come back and have a discussion about where you place them at, and if we can get a consolidated agreement on where they sit before we leave today, then that, as Richard said, we don't waste a lot of time and effort on 6 models to look into further.
Can I just ask a question?
Yes.
If it seems wrong.
Of the whole, are you comfortable that all 6 of these models fit with the mandate we currently have from our ratepayers for this money?
They can be, because you're based on your definition of what large scale is. If your definition of large scale is to invest in $500,000 initiatives and you run a contestable process for it, you can do that. If you say that by our interpretation of large scale is that we want to have a collaborative arrangement where we access other money and then we jointly, collectively as local authorities give out money for biodiversity outcomes, then we can do that too. I think it's and that's why and you weren't here for the first definition and kind of outcome discussion, but that was sort of, it can be what you make it. I suppose it's what's the best model within your context as an organisation, because I think one of the other things we touched on earlier is there's not necessarily one right way. It's the right way for how you want the money used and the outcomes you want to achieve.
Okay, yeah, no, sorry for being missing that first section, but it's just the joint venture partnership type element in my mind, is starting to step almost once removed from council holding these funds and then looking to allocate them. And so I'm not sure that our ratepayers would be quite as on board with accepting that increase if other parties are going to then be making the call.
Yeah, and that's the reality of the risks and some of the challenges in each model. And so part of this now where you place them is assessing in your own minds the level of risk that you're comfortable with as councillors of if this was happening in practice and this was our gold standard, can we realistically do that within our requirements as councillors, our transparency,
Well,
being
that's why
accountable to our ratepayers?
I'm worried one or two of these models maybe shouldn't be here in the first instance.
That's what they'll come out, they'll come out in that
Just
process.
mark them in the red.
Oh,
folder.
they're on, yeah, I think that's quite simple, to be honest, it's a process. They'll end up in the red. Yeah, it's a no.
Yeah.
You
Some
can
of
go
them
to
are
the
good.
desk, we'll show you how it's done.
What do you, couple we like and couple we don't. In the middle.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay,
And
so
I'm not
it's-
sure
it's
if
just
I'm
right,
making
a bit
or
to
not,
the
but we just need to get to bits and crosses.
See, man.
Just,
That's what I don't like, but I don't understand. We can make it up in our own head. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. If you've got a high risk and high cost and high effort, or someone should probably investigate. That's why I want to put that it's high and that it's low.
I know, I wanted to do that.
What is the effort? Who's the effort?
So it can be whatever the interpretation is, right? So from the definition that I created as
There's
part
two
of
ways I'm looking at it.
some of this can be that. If you've
No,
got.
a bit of No, you see, I would, that's not how I see it. You see, if it's an efficient system. Yeah, if it's an efficient system,
Yeah.
the effort should be low.
Yeah.
And that's where I think that that's wrong, because I wouldn't want to investigate. Sorry, it's.
And it might be that things that come out here, we often go, actually, once we look at those.
I've got two of them.
And it might be that we, when you look at investigate, I was just saying tonight, it might be.
For this. I was
if
just
you put
checking
those things
so that
into
there's no.
one, and you might actually go, well, actually,
So then gotta figure out.
see investigate.
And that's about different.
The risk is so high that actually we're opting not to
But
investigate.
we're not
We
guaranteeing
would
we're
like
picking up any
to look
at
at
this
the
stage
ones
unless
that
we
are
do
prioritised
option
and
three.
consider.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily automatic that goes in, it's just thinking about how they rate
For example. Yeah,
against
there's always ways.
Okay. Okay.
Okay.
Okay, what do you want to take out?
But they
Can we
could.
agree?
Well, there's two
Sorry,
items,
we're done.
two to take out.
They could get direct
I like
funding.
that.
And you're gonna have to tell me why you want to take it out of legal.
Okay, now we're taking it out, of course.
Will,
And that was one of the
So what was it?
criteria or whatever.
Because it doesn't allow the ORC to say that.
Some of your, where?
It was really difficult for the, organisations that,
So it's high effort. Yeah,
yeah, so what is it? All right, we're gonna do that.
it's one. So one is because it's, I'm changing that around because it's high effort from the community.
And it is a
High
high
risk.
risk.
It's
It's not actually high.
No, you've got.
You're gonna start at that immediately.
Don't worry
What we want to do them is get them.
And you're gonna have to tell. when you put that
Well, are there any that we want to rule out and then we don't.
Yes.
As opposed to going.
And instead of doing it that way, let's start here. Which one's any?
And because it's easy, isn't it?
This is Ellen.
I don't know if I do. Rule it out. I definitely don't want to put all amounts of money in, but I don't want to rule out.
Okay, that's why you've got. I'm not sure either. That's fine. Well, you can just say the cost of them is just so great But
what they want.
Oh, we don't really know.
They contest the amount, maybe.
Stuff is more like opening the
Just want to
versus the traditional, there is still procurement process. This is what we want.
We've always had way more.
Oh, are they enforcing criteria that sits underneath? They'll give us a.
But we said this is what we want.
No, I'm not stressed, but just a heads up. This is the area.
Not gonna
rank it, Joe?
Yeah.
Oh, well, then just like that.
We're not gonna do that.
Larger.
Middle match and we want you to work on.
Oh, yes.
But isn't that option two?
That's option three.
Through the strengths and
It's
options.
like-
Barry, so.
2 and 3.
But option 3 isn't actually known as mine.
Option three is more community.
Yeah, that's a basic plan.
I
Rather
think
than us saying, we're here.
we're heading towards.
You've got the other extreme.
Maybe.
I think that's where we're going, unless we do hit that one, I think we may be.
I've always been.
And that's partly because of the capabilities and how groups in different areas are developed. And it's.
So well, this one is. It all fits into what you're saying.
This work out.
Not really.
I think the witness study.
Yeah, I'm happy
Because
with rolling that
that
one out.
doesn't.
I'm very happy with
that passes the problem down the
I
line.
think the risk is what
Yeah.
quite actually know.
Model 5 also just seemed a bit unclear as to what
For my part of
possibilities
the.
are, but I'm not, I don't necessarily want to rule it out, yeah.
Can I just say, as a offline, we're offline. Are we, is the mic turned off?
Not sure.
I know.
Please one thing. Probably won't be.
Don't publish it straight away, so we look at it and decide, was there stuff on there that needs to come off as well before it goes
One
up?
of my really.
It's a discussion. I am really.
Doesn't go live.
One of my